That's your mother's secret partner. From years before she ever married me.
Dad, what are you talking about? There are a lot of people here, Dad.
Ask your mother. Am I right, Delilah? Is this true, Mom? Say something.
Hey, I once heard from someone that Delilah always said Everett would sign anything you gave him. Really? Everett?
Shh, keep it down.
What are you doing?
By the way, I also have a few things I'd like to say.
I don't understand what you're saying. What is this?
This was never real forgiveness. This was evidence.
My name is Everett Griffin. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my life, I believed one simple thing. If you build something with your own two hands and you protect the people you love, life will treat you fairly in the end. I was standing on a deck in Bucktown, Chicago, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't asked for, when my wife's hand closed around my wrist so hard it left 4 little half-moons in my skin. "We need to leave," Delilah whispered. "Right now." I asked her why. She didn't answer that. She just said, "Don't turn around yet," and her voice had a shake in it I hadn't heard from her in 30 years. Before we get into the story, if you've ever poured everything you had into your family, only to find out later that trust was the one thing they were counting on, stay with me. Because that night, on a deck strung with twinkle lights, I found out exactly how much of my life had been a performance. Let me back up just a little, so you can see the evening the way I saw it, before I knew anything was wrong. It was the last warm Saturday in September, the kind Chicago gives you right before it takes the warmth away for good. The housewarming was for Hendrix, our son, 34 years old, and his home in Bucktown, a graystone with a rebuilt kitchen and a backyard deck he'd had redone in cedar. String lights crossed overhead like a canopy of small suns. Somebody had a playlist going, low horns and brushed drums, the kind of jazz that makes a party feel expensive even when it isn't. The smell of grilled corn drifted over from the side patio, and ice clinked in glasses all around me. I'd been admiring the kitchen island for 20 minutes, running my hand along the quartz the way I used to run my hand along the hood of a car I was proud of. A neighbor named Paul, who'd wandered over from 3 doors down, was telling me about his sciatica and his riding mower in the same breath, and I was nodding along, content, half listening, the way a man gets when he's exactly where he expects to be in his own life. Somewhere behind me, a phone camera flashed, catching the string lights in a blur of gold. A woman I didn't recognize laughed at something near the drink table. For one more moment, the evening still belonged to me, a proud father, a contented husband, a man who figured the hard years had finally paid off. I thought, briefly, of the men who'd stood beside me when the company was young. Welders and machinists who'd taken pay cuts so I wouldn't have to lay anyone off. Back when trust between us was the only collateral we had. I owed that same trust to my own family, without question. That was the last easy minute of the night. Delilah's grip tightened again. When I turned my head slightly, I saw her face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Pale, drawn, her eyes fixed on something behind me near the side gate. I heard Hendrix's voice rise over the music, loose and easy, talking to a knot of his friends by the fire pit. "My old man thinks this is his money," he was saying, and there was laughter folding in around the words. 200 grand, cash, no paper. Man just handed it over 'cause I asked nice. I felt something go still in my chest. 200 grand. He was talking about the $180,000 I'd wired him 9 months earlier. A gift, I'd told myself. No strings, no paperwork. Because that's what you do for your son when he's buying his first real house. I hadn't asked for a promissory note. I hadn't asked for anything. I trusted him the way I trusted the sunrise to come up over Lake Michigan every morning, without needing proof. Ron says he's still got the '09 mortgage stories memorized, Hendricks went on, and his friends laughed harder. Man mortgaged his own house to make payroll one year. 18-hour days. Missed my whole 8th grade year, basically. But hey, worked out for me. I stood there holding a glass of champagne I still hadn't tasted, smiling the polite smile a man learns to wear at his own expense, while my son turned 20 years of sacrifice into a punchline for people I'd never met. My thumb found the stem of my glass and pressed hard enough to whiten the knuckle, a small, private argument with myself about whether laughter this careless deserved forgiveness or an answer. Then Delilah's hand went rigid on my arm, and I heard her breath catch, a small, sharp sound like something tearing quietly. I followed her stare toward the side gate where a man had just stepped through into the light. He was solidly built, maybe late 50s, dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair and a gold chain that caught the string lights every time he moved. His suit was a little too sharp for a backyard party, the kind of sharp that says, "I want you to notice this suit." He smiled at the crowd like he already belonged there. "Delilah," I said quietly. "Who is that?" Her lips barely moved. "That's Forrest," she said. "He shouldn't be here." Her eyes flicked once toward Hendricks before they found Forrest again, quick as a struck match, and just as quickly put out. Something in the way she said his name, not confused, not curious, but afraid, told me this wasn't a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. My wife knew exactly who he was, and whatever she knew, she'd been carrying it quietly for a long time. I looked back at Hendricks, still holding court by the fire pit, still laughing. "He trusts me enough to sign anything I put in front of him," he was telling his friends now, raising his glass. "That's just how Dad is." I smiled at Paul, said something about the quartz countertop being a beautiful choice, and took a slow sip of champagne I didn't want. But in my head, there was only one thought, turning over and over like a stone in a river. They were talking about me, and Delilah already knew. The next morning, I called Ron. Ron Delgado had done my accounting for 19 years, since before Hendricks could tie his own shoes, and when I asked him to pull the title records on the Bucktown house, he went quiet in a way that told me he already didn't like what he was about to find. 4 days later, he called back, and his voice had lost its usual warmth. "Everett," he said, "the $180,000 isn't listed as a gift. It's recorded as a second mortgage, and it's subordinate behind a first lien of $340,000 held by a man named Forrest Idris. The house itself is titled in Hannah's name alone." I sat at my kitchen table in Lincoln Park for a long time after that call, looking at nothing in particular. Not Hendricks's name on the deed, not mine. Hannah's, alone, with 2 loans stacked on top of that house like bricks nobody had asked my permission to lay. For a moment, I was back on Webster Avenue, the summer Hendricks turned 9, running alongside his bicycle with one hand hovering near the seat, promising I wouldn't let go until he said so. He'd yelled at me to let go before he was ready, fell twice, and got back up both times without crying. I sat there now, wondering when exactly he'd stopped needing me to hold the seat, or if he ever really had. That night, while Delilah was in the shower, I opened her old laptop, the one she kept in the hallway closet and rarely used anymore. I told myself I was just checking the Wi-Fi password. What I found instead was a folder of drafts, unsent, dated back to 2019, right after I sold my company. One read, "I need you to structure it so the money from Everett's sale isn't easy to divide later. I'm thinking Hendrix." It was addressed to Forrest. I closed the laptop slowly, the way you close a door on a room you're not ready to walk back into. The next week, I took Hendrix to lunch on Michigan Avenue at the steakhouse he liked, the one with the leather booths. I asked him, gently, what a second lien was doing on his house. He didn't flinch. "That's just tax structuring, Dad," he said, cutting into his ribeye like we were discussing the Bears' draft picks. For just a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Gone before I could name it, there and then buried again, like a man repeating a line he'd been handed rather than one he actually believed. I nodded. I paid for lunch, like always. I even left the tip a little larger than usual, the way you do when you want a room to believe nothing has changed in it. But something had changed. I just wasn't ready to show my hand yet. The following Sunday, I drove out to Bucktown again, told Delilah and Hendrix I still didn't understand all this legal paperwork, and asked if we could go through it slowly, together, like a confused old man wanting his family's help. While Hendrix went to find the folder, I watched Delilah's thumb move fast across her phone screen, deleting something, her face tight with concentration. Later that night, I found the draft she hadn't sent yet, still sitting in her outbox. It read, "Everett's asking too many questions. We need to move faster before he brings in a lawyer." They weren't just planning. They were watching me and adjusting. Standing outside the back fence of the Bucktown house one evening, under the cover of a maple tree that had started dropping its first red leaves, I heard Delilah laughing softly with Hendrix through the screen door. "Forrest structured it so if we ever split up or sell the house, his money evaporates, unless we choose to pay it back ourselves," she said. "He's protected us both ways." I stood there in the cooling autumn air and understood fully, for the first time, that this wasn't something being done to my wife. She was inside it. She was benefiting from it. I told her everything the next morning, the lien, the drafts, all of it, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where I'd once helped Hendrix with long division. She didn't cry. She just looked at me, steady as stone, and said, "Then let's be smart about this." We hired Diane Sue, a forensic accountant I'd worked with years earlier during a business dispute. Diane was thorough, quiet, and did not believe in wasted words. 10 days later, Diane sat across from me with a folder an inch thick. "Forrest Idris has run at least 11 transactions like this one in the last 3 years," she said. "Same pattern every time. Family gift gets reframed as a private loan. Lien gets filed quietly. Title goes to the younger partner, not the parent's child directly, so it's harder to trace back to the original money. A system, not a mistake. A business. And Delilah had known about it from the very beginning." I decided, that week, to become someone Hendrix and Delilah wouldn't think to fear. A confused, aging father, easily managed, easily reassured. I started calling Hendrix more often, my voice soft and a little lost. I left my reading glasses in my shirt pocket on purpose. "Can you explain this to your old man again?" I'd ask. And he'd sigh like it was a burden and explain, and never once suspect that every phone call became one more entry in the notebook I kept locked in my desk drawer. Dated, detailed, written out word for word the same night I heard it. One afternoon, I walked into Forrest's office on West Grand Avenue as a plain walk-in, my own name on the sign-in sheet, letting the young receptionist believe I was simply shopping around for title services. Her name was Casey, and her monitor was angled just slightly toward the waiting area. I caught the letterhead before she noticed. Idris Title Services. Casey, friendly and a little too talkative for her own good, mentioned, without my even asking, how Mr. Idris likes helping families structure things when their kids are buying homes. She said it like a selling point. I thanked her and left before she could see my hands were shaking. A week after that, a cousin of Hannah's, a soft-spoken woman named Renata, mentioned to me at a coffee shop on Damon Avenue that Delilah had once recommended the same kind of structure to her own brother for his house in Rogers Park. She said it warmly, like she was praising Delilah's generosity. "Your wife's so good with money stuff," Renata told me, stirring sugar into her coffee. "She walked my brother through the whole thing, saved him a fortune in taxes," she said. I smiled and thanked her for the coffee, and drove home with both hands tight on the wheel, my jaw aching from how hard I'd been holding it still. Delilah hadn't just gone along with this. She was recommending it, spreading it, believing in it, or at least believing it was worth the harm it caused. That evening, I sat in my study long after the house had gone quiet, looking at a corkboard I'd started keeping. Dates, names, dollar amounts, all connected with red string like something out of a detective show Delilah used to tease me for watching. I thought about the version of myself standing on that deck in Bucktown, smiling over a champagne glass, and I didn't recognize him anymore. Sorting through old photographs for Diane's file, I'd lingered too long on one from Hendrix's 8th birthday, searching his face for something I couldn't quite name, before telling myself, as I always had, that it didn't matter. That man still believed love meant never asking questions. I was becoming a different kind of man now, one who loved just as hard, but who no longer confused love with blindness. By the time Diane called me on a rainy Thursday evening, her voice careful, I already suspected what she was about to say. "Everett," she said, "we've connected your case to 2 other families now filing complaints. Combined losses are past $2.4 million. The state's attorney's financial crimes unit has already reached out." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, rain tapping the kitchen window, and felt something settle in me. Not triumph, not yet. Just the quiet certainty that there was still one more layer to this, something none of us had uncovered yet, waiting underneath everything else like a stone at the bottom of a cold river. She knew about the fraud. She helped build it. She profited from it. Now you decide. Comment Team Delilah if loving her son excuses what she did, or Team Everett if knowing about it makes her just as guilty as Forrest. Pick one. No fence sitting. The engagement dinner was Hendrix and Hannah's idea. 22 guests, catered, held at our house in Lincoln Park because, as Hannah put it on the phone, we want your parents' blessing to really mean something. I said yes before Delilah even finished relaying the message. I had my reasons. The dining room looked beautiful that night. White tablecloths, candles down the center, the good china Delilah had inherited from her mother, the one with the thin gold rim we only brought out for Christmas and christenings. 22 people laughing, clinking glasses, the whole room warm with the kind of noise a happy family is supposed to make. Someone had brought a bottle of good bourbon. Someone else had brought flowers that were already wilting slightly in the warmth of the room. I remember thinking, even then, how ordinary it all looked, how much like every other family dinner we'd ever had. I'd spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for this evening, not the seating chart or the menu, which Delilah had handled beautifully, but the folder sitting in my study upstairs, copies of the title records, Diane's forensic report, and the unsent email draft I'd found and printed weeks earlier. I hadn't told Delilah how much I already knew, or how much of it was already sitting with my attorney. I'd only told her I wanted our son's engagement dinner to be perfect. Hendrix stood up near the end of the meal, champagne flute in hand, tapping it lightly with a fork. "I want to toast my dad," he said, grinning at the table, "who still doesn't totally understand what a lien is, but has been very generous about it." Laughter rolled around the table. "Some men build companies. My dad built confusion. But hey, It's worked out great for the rest of us." The table laughed harder. Hannah laughed loudest of all, her hand pressed to her chest like he'd said something delightful. Somewhere down the table, a fork scraped too loud against porcelain. And for half a second, nobody moved. The kind of pause a room takes right before it decides which way to lean. I stood up slowly. The room went quiet, the way a room does when it senses, before it understands, that something has shifted. "I understand liens just fine," I said, my voice even. "This one in particular. A second lien, sitting behind a first mortgage of $340,000, held by Forrest Idris, my wife's secret partner, from years before she ever married me." I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't need to. "3 weeks ago," I said, "I stood outside your back fence, Delilah, under the maple tree, and I heard every word. You and Hendricks, talking about how Forrest structured this so his money would simply evaporate unless the two of you chose, on your own, to pay it back. I've had 3 weeks to make sure I remembered it exactly." I watched something break loose behind Hendricks's eyes as my words landed. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first crack of a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on was never actually his. 22 faces turned toward Hendricks, then toward Delilah, then back to me. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a letter Hendricks himself had helped draft months earlier, meant to make the $180,000 look, on paper, like a private loan I had formally forgiven, back when he still believed I'd never look closely enough to need it undone. I held it up so the whole table could see both signatures clearly. Then I tore it cleanly in half and let the pieces fall onto his empty dinner plate. The room had gone so silent I could hear the candle flames. "This was never real forgiveness," I said. "It was evidence. And starting Monday, it belongs to my attorney, the State Real Estate Commission, and, if Forrest would like, the Financial Crimes Division of the state's attorney's office." That's when Renata, sitting near the end of the table, said something out loud that she probably meant only for the person beside her. "Delilah always told us Everett would sign anything you put in front of him because he trusts family so much. That's actually why we used the same structure for my cousin's place." Every head at that table turned to look at Delilah, not with sympathy, with something closer to recognition, like they were seeing for the first time a woman they thought they knew. Delilah's hand found the stem of her wine glass and gripped it without lifting it, her knuckles pale against the crystal, as if the glass alone might hold her upright. Delilah's composure cracked wide open. She began to cry, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere old and buried. And through the tears, she admitted she'd introduced Forrest to Hendricks to protect his future, and that she had taken money from Forrest herself for doing it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, and something colder settling underneath the tired. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, and something colder settling underneath the tired. I picked up my champagne glass, looked at it, and set it back down without drinking. "I'm not confused," I said quietly, to no one and everyone. "I never was. I just wanted to see how long the two of you would keep talking, and how much of it you'd let Renata's family lose right alongside mine before anyone stopped you." Delilah's hands were shaking now, badly enough that her fork rattled against her plate. Hendricks hadn't moved. 20 guests sat frozen around a table set for celebration, the candles still burning steadily like nothing in the world had changed, though everything just had. I looked at my son, 34 years old, still in the tuxedo jacket he'd worn to impress people he'd known his whole life, and felt 34 years of memory pull hard at my chest all at once. Every ball game, every school project finished at midnight, every dollar I'd ever handed over without asking a single question. None of it had prepared me to sit there and watch him say nothing at all, while his own mother admitted, in front of 22 people, exactly what she'd done. I stood there a moment longer, let the silence stretch until it hurt, and then I said the only thing that felt true. We're not finished. Not tonight, and not for a while yet. There are 2 other families in this city who lost money to Forrest Idris. By Monday, my attorney will have everything you just heard, in writing, with every date attached. Nobody at that table said a word as I walked out of my own dining room, past the torn letter, past my crying wife, past my son's ruined face, and out onto the back porch, into air that had turned sharp and cold sometime while none of us were paying attention. The old porch swing creaked once behind me in the wind, the same rusted hinge I'd been meaning to oil for years, and some part of me noted, absurdly, that even a neglected thing could still hold its shape better than the family I'd just left inside. Behind me, through the window, I could still see them all sitting there, frozen around a table that had been set, only an hour earlier, for celebration. Delilah hadn't moved from her chair. Hendrik stood now, one hand braced against the back of it, staring at nothing. Hannah had gone very quiet, her earlier laughter nowhere to be found. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that love meant never keeping score, that a good husband, a good father, simply gave again and again and trusted the giving to be enough. Standing on that porch, I understood for the first time that trust without truth isn't love at all. It's just a longer, quieter kind of blindness. And somewhere out past the porch light, the first cold rain of the season was just beginning to fall. I told myself the hardest part of that night was already behind me. I was wrong about that, though I wouldn't understand exactly how wrong until a knock came at that same door 3 weeks later in a storm far colder than this one. Rain fell hard and steady that night, the cold late October kind that Chicago doesn't apologize for. I was sitting alone in the kitchen in Winkin Park, a mug of coffee going cold in front of me, listening to the gutters overflow outside the window, when the doorbell rang. Hendricks stood on the porch, his jacket soaked through, thinner than I remembered him being just weeks earlier at that dinner table. All the polish from the housewarming party was gone. No gold watch catching the light, no easy grin for a crowd of friends. He looked, for the first time in years, like a boy again. The same boy who used to stand on this same porch after football practice, waiting for me to unlock the door. "Dad," he said, water dripping off his chin. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but I don't have anywhere else to go tonight." I stood in the doorway, the porch light casting yellow over both of us, rain running off the eaves between us like a curtain neither of us could see through. 34 years of being his father pulled hard at my chest in that moment. I thought of every night I'd worked late instead of coming home, every fever of his I'd missed while I was somewhere else, making sure there'd be a home for him to have a fever in. I thought of my wife upstairs, likely listening through the floorboards, waiting to see what I'd decide. "You have somewhere to go, Hendricks," I said, steady, not unkind. "Just not here. Not tonight. Not until you've done the work to earn back what you broke." He nodded. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things I might once have expected from him. He just turned and walked back down the steps into the rain, shoulders bent. And I closed the door, firm, but not slammed. I stood there a moment with my hand still flat against the wood, listening to his footsteps fade into the sound of the storm. I stayed there longer than I needed to, my palm still cooling against the wood grain, listening to the rain fill in behind him. An old picture rose up on its own. Hendricks at 9, wobbling down Webster Avenue on a bike with the training wheels just off, both of us laughing, before either of us had learned to be afraid of falling. I let myself keep it for one breath, then put it away. because I was only just beginning to understand that a man could love someone with his whole chest and still refuse, calmly, to open a door for them. Delilah came in a little later with 2 mugs of tea, and we sat at the kitchen table without speaking for what felt like 10 full minutes. She'd made it the way she always did, a little too much honey, the way I liked it. As if the habit of caring for me hadn't caught up yet with everything else that had changed between us. The rain kept its rhythm against the window. Neither of us reached for the silence to fill it. Then the doorbell rang again. Hendrix stood there, soaked worse than before, holding out a small black flash drive with a hand that wasn't steady. "I found this in Mom's old jewelry box," he said. "I think you need to see it." I plugged the drive into my laptop right there at the kitchen table, under the warm yellow light over the stove. Delilah sat across from me, her face draining of color the way the sky drains of light in November. There was a voice memo first, old, the audio a little rough. Delilah's voice, younger, talking to Forrest. "If Everett ever finds out Hendrix isn't his by blood, the money from the company sale is the only thing that would keep this family together at all." I sat with that for a long moment. Here is something I hadn't told Delilah, hadn't told anyone, in over 3 decades. I already knew. I'd known since a night in 1998 when Delilah, 3 glasses of wine past her usual caution, told me the truth and then begged me the next morning to forget she'd said it. I remember exactly where we were standing, our old apartment on Fullerton, the radiator ticking, Hendrix asleep down the hall in a room we'd painted pale yellow that same spring. I chose, that year, to raise him as my own in every way that mattered. And I never once made him feel like anything less than fully mine. That wasn't a lie I told myself. It was a decision I made with open eyes. And in 34 years, I never regretted it for a single day. I still kept the cribmobile from that room in a box in the attic, plastic stars gone yellow with age. Some nights, long before any of this, I'd climb up there for no reason at all, just to touch it. Watching her face crumble in that kitchen light, I understood her secrecy had never really been about greed. It was fear, old and familiar, that the truth about Hendrix would collapse 34 years of marriage in a single sentence. She wanted, more than the money, to keep this family whole, even if holding it together meant lying to the man at its center. And that contradiction was the war she'd been fighting inside herself since before Hendrix could walk. She chose silence again tonight for the same reason she always had, never once imagining I'd already forgiven the truth years ago, and was only waiting for her to trust me with it. But the drive had more on it. A video file, older, dated sometime in 2018, grainy dashcam-style footage from inside a parked car, rain streaking the windshield in the background even then, as if the weather itself had been rehearsing for this night. Delilah and Forrest, talking, unhurried, like people with all the time in the world. "Once Everett's company sale clears," Forrest said on the recording, his voice low and confident, "we move the assets over to Hendrix, slowly. Small transfers, spread out over a few years. He won't suspect anything. Man trusts family too much to ever check." Delilah's voice, softer, agreeing without hesitation. "By the time he notices, there won't be enough left to fight for. He'll just have his name on paper, nothing else. And Hendrix will have everything, free and clear." Forrest laughed on the recording, a low, satisfied sound. "That's the beauty of trust," he said. "It does all the work for you." The kitchen was silent except for the rain against the glass and the small, tinny voices still playing from my laptop speakers. I let it play all the way through, every second of it, because I owed myself that much after everything I'd swallowed quietly for years. This wasn't about $180,000. It had never been about $180,000. It was a plan, built years in advance, to take nearly everything I'd worked for after I sold my company, using our son as the vehicle to move it. and leaving me, eventually, with nothing but a name on a piece of paper and the story of a man who'd trusted too easily. Listening to that recording, I understood this went far beyond one lie or one lean. It was a strategy built on the calculation that my love for this family would always outweigh my instinct to protect myself. And that realization cut far deeper than the money ever could.
Some part of me wanted to shout, to demand answers, to make her feel even a fraction of what I felt. But a colder, steadier part of me understood that rage would only hand them one more version of me to manage. So I chose silence instead. Not because I'd stopped feeling it, but because for the first time in this whole ordeal, I needed them to wonder what I'd do next, instead of the other way around. I didn't shout. My face, I'm told, barely moved at all, but something behind my eyes had changed completely, the way a light changes when a bulb finally, quietly, burns out. I closed the laptop slowly. The kitchen went dark except for the stove light overhead. Delilah was crying now, the kind of crying that doesn't ask to be comforted, just witnessed. I sat there in the near dark for a long moment, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter than I expected. "Everything you did," I said, "all of it, was just to protect a plan you made a long time ago?" She didn't answer. Maybe there wasn't an answer left that would have meant anything. I sat there in that kitchen a long while after she'd gone upstairs, the rain still falling steady against the window, the flash drive sitting dark and small on the table between two cold mugs of tea. I thought about the porch swing out back that had been creaking since before Hendrix was born, the one I kept meaning to oil and never did. I thought about all the ordinary Saturdays I'd assumed we still had ahead of us. And I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that the man I'd been on that deck in Bucktown, holding a champagne glass and believing every word his family told him, was someone I would never be again. Whatever came next, it would be built by a different version of me. One who still loved this family, but who would never again mistake silence for peace or trust for the same thing as truth. I called Hendrix the next morning. My voice was calm, the way it always is once I've decided something. "You can come for dinner Saturday if you want," I said, "but only if you're ready to tell the truth about all of it. Who you owe, and why you agreed to that structure in the first place. No excuses, just the truth." He agreed. He showed up on time, which surprised me a little, and we ate mostly in silence, the good plates set aside in favor of the everyday ones, which felt more honest somehow. The only sound was the scrape of forks against ceramic and the tick of the kitchen clock we'd never fixed, its second hand catching every few beats, like it needed a moment to decide whether to keep going. Delilah had made pot roast, the same recipe she'd been making since before Hendrix was born. And for a few minutes, over that familiar smell of onions and thyme, it almost felt like an ordinary Saturday. Almost. After the meal, I brought out the flash drive he'd handed me in the rain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I've known about your blood since before you could walk, Hendrix," I said. "I chose to raise you as my own. That was my decision, and I've never regretted it. But from here forward, there's no more room in this family for anything less than the truth." He cried then, really cried, the kind of crying I hadn't seen from him since he was 7 years old and fell off his bike on Webster Avenue. He apologized over and over and asked if there was any way to start over. I didn't forgive him on the spot. Forgiveness isn't a light switch, and I'd stopped pretending it was somewhere back around that dinner table with the torn paper on his plate. Instead, I laid out terms, plain and specific. He'd work part-time at my old company, starting at the bottom, no management title, no shortcuts. He'd cut off all contact with Forrest and with Hannah, effective immediately. He'd earn his way back, one honest month at a time, and I told him plainly that trust, once broken this badly, gets rebuilt in small increments, not grand gestures. I thought, saying it, of the summer I taught him to change the oil on his first car in the driveway on Webster Avenue. How patient he'd been then, asking me to show him twice before trusting himself to do it alone. That boy was still in there, somewhere. I intended to give him the chance to prove it, but not yet the benefit of the doubt. "I don't expect you to hand me anything," he said quietly. "I just want the chance to actually earn it this time." That was the first true thing I'd heard him say in a long while. Delilah began seeing a therapist that same week, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who came recommended by our family doctor. I drove her to the first 2 appointments myself, sat in the parking lot both times with the radio off, and didn't ask what was said inside. Some things a person has to carry to the door themselves. She came out of that second session with her eyes red, but her shoulders a little less tight than they'd been in months, and she reached for my hand in the car without either of us saying a word about it. One evening, not long after, my wife and I sat together in that same kitchen, 2 cups of tea between us, rain still tapping lightly against the window like it hadn't quite finished with us yet. "You knew," she said quietly, "all this time, and you still stayed?" "For him," I said, "and because I loved you. Once. Enough to choose you, even with the truth sitting right there in the room." She didn't say anything for a long time after that. She just looked at her tea like it might have an answer written somewhere in the steam. That weekend, I drove out to a nursery on Elston Avenue and bought a small bur oak sapling, no taller than my shoulder, its roots wrapped tight in burlap. I planted it myself in the backyard, in the same spot where Hendrix used to set up a plastic kiddie pool every June, back when he still believed the whole world was as simple as summer. My knees ached kneeling in that dirt the way they hadn't ached 10 years ago, and I thought, not unkindly, that some things about getting older you just have to make peace with. "This will grow," I told Delilah, patting the loose soil down around the base. "But it needs strong roots first. Same as us if we're going to make it." She knelt down beside me in the grass and helped me tamp the soil with her bare hands, saying nothing, which was, for the first time in a long while, exactly the right thing to say. The last of the daylight caught the wedding ring she still wore, and for just a moment I let myself remember why I'd put it there in the first place, 36 years ago, in a church on the south side that doesn't exist anymore. There's one more thing I never told anyone. Not Delilah, not Diane, not even my own attorney. Years earlier, not long after that night on Fullerton Avenue when I first learned the truth, I quietly opened a trust for Hendrix. Small deposits at first, then larger ones as the business grew. I never told him. I never told Delilah. I did it because whatever else was true, whatever secrets sat underneath our family, he was still my son in every way that mattered to me, and I intended to make sure he was protected, even from things he didn't yet know he needed protecting from. I think that's the part of this story people miss when they imagine quiet men like me. They assume our silence means we don't see clearly. Most of the time, it means the opposite. We see everything. We just choose, carefully, what to do about it, and when. Standing in that backyard with the last of the evening light slanting gold across the fence, Delilah beside me with dirt on her hands and tears drying on her face, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Not victory, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to peace. But peace, I was learning, doesn't arrive all at once. It has to be planted, tended, and given time to take root. Same as anything else worth keeping. Months later, I found myself alone in the kitchen again on a quiet, rainy night. Looking out at the small bur oak in the backyard, its thin branches catching what little light spilled from the porch. The house was quiet, the way houses get once the worst of the storm has passed through. Not empty, just settled. Like everyone inside has finally exhaled. "You're not my blood," I said quietly, not to anyone in particular, just to the dark glass of the window and whatever was listening. "But I chose you a long time ago, and I made sure you'd be all right, even on the day everything finally came apart. Everything I'd done, the quiet watching, the calls where I played the confused old man, the notebook I kept dated and detailed, the boundary I drew on a rainy porch and refused to move from. None of it had been about revenge. It had been about a man who'd lived with the truth for over 3 decades and chose, over and over, to protect what he loved anyway. Every twist before this one, every betrayal uncovered, had only been leading toward that same simple fact. I walked out onto the back porch that night, just for a minute, the rain light and almost gentle against my shoulders. I put my hand flat against the trunk of that young oak, still thin enough that I could nearly wrap my fingers all the way around it. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and went quiet again, and a porch light 2 doors down clicked on the way it did every night around that hour, like the whole neighborhood was settling in for sleep around me. "I'm not going to let anyone take what I've built," I said quietly. "Not even someone I once loved more than anything else in this world." I want to leave you with something more than just the ending of a story. This story reminds us that loving your family and watching over what you've built were never two separate things. They were always meant to be the same act, done with the same open hands. If you still sit down every first Saturday morning to go over the bills, don't stop. But this year, walk into the Walgreens on the corner and buy the plainest black marbled composition notebook they've got. Keep it in the kitchen drawer with the takeout menus, and every time you sign your name to something, a check, a deed, a favor for a grandchild, write down the date and what you signed, right there in your own handwriting before you can talk yourself out of it. If a grown child calls asking to borrow the title to your house, or your social security number for something I'll explain later, you don't need a lawyer's voice to say no. Just put the coffee pot on, tell them Sunday morning works better, and ask them to bring the paperwork with them so you can read it out loud together, at your own kitchen table, in your own good light. Call the one friend who still remembers your working years, not to talk about any of this, just to ask what they had for dinner. Trust rebuilds faster over small, ordinary phone calls than it ever does over big conversations. And when your own porch swing starts creaking, don't rush out to replace it. Oil the hinge yourself first. Sit back down. Let the people who love you hear that sound and decide on their own to come finish the job. None of this is suspicion. It's just what love looks like once it's learned to keep its eyes open. I still see Hendrix most weeks now. He's working his way back, slowly, honestly. And some Sundays, he comes by just to sit on the porch with me. No agenda, no ask, just company. He fixed that old porch swing last month without me even asking him to. Replaced the rusted chain, sanded down the wood, oiled the hinge that had been creaking since sometime around the Eisenhower administration, as far as either of us could remember. We didn't talk about it much. We didn't need to. Delilah and I are still finding our way to whatever comes next for us. Not the marriage we started with, but maybe, in time, an honest one, which is worth more anyway. Some evenings we still sit with our tea and say very little. And I've come to understand that the silence between us now is a different kind than before. It isn't hiding anything anymore. It's just two people, tired and a little older, learning how to rest in each other's company again. The oak tree is still small. It'll be years before it gives real shade, but I check on it most mornings with my coffee, the same way I used to check on Hendrix's crib when he was small enough to fit in one arm. Some things you plant, and then you wait. You trust the roots to do their work, quietly, underground, where nobody can see them. The same way I did, all those years, without ever saying a word. If you've ever been the one who found out too late, or the one who quietly knew and stayed anyway. I hope you know there's no shame in either. There's only the choice you make next. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of your own family, your own porch, your own quiet strength, I'd love to hear about it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so we can sit down again together next time. Written from a human heart, with AI only as a supporting friend. This story was born to awaken the belief, no matter how severely tested, kindness and integrity will prevail, because the universe always leans toward those who dare to live with dignity and a sincere heart.